Far beyond the towers of Hogwarts and the winding streets of the wizarding world, there are stories that fade with time, and others that wait patiently in the smallest forgotten corners. Good evening, dear listener. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you into a mystery hidden not within grand battles or famous legends, but within details so small they were almost ignored. The candles are burning low, the corridors are quiet, and somewhere in the shadows, an old design is beginning to stir. Come, let us uncover it together. The war had ended, yet the silence it left behind wasn't the kind that brought comfort, but rather the sort that lingered in corridors and settled into the bones of those who had survived it, as though the world itself had not yet decided whether it was truly safe again. And nowhere was that feeling stronger than within the ancient walls of Hogwarts, where the scars of battle had been repaired in stone, but not entirely in spirit. It was on a quiet evening, long after students had retired to their dormitories and the castle had fallen into its familiar hush, that a young Auror named Elric Vane stood beneath the dim glow of enchanted torches in a ministry archive room far removed from the warmth of Hogwarts, surrounded by rows of evidence collected during the final days of the war against Lord Voldemort. And though most of these items had already been catalogued, studied, and deemed harmless, there was something about one particular crate that refused to sit quietly in his mind. The crate itself was unremarkable, filled with objects that appeared almost laughably mundane compared to the horrors that had once defined the Dark Lord's reign, including a cracked silver goblet, a tarnished brooch, several pieces of old parchment, and a chipped wand of no identifiable core. Yet, as Elric carefully examined each item, he found himself unsettled by a subtle, persistent sensation, as though each object carried the faintest whisper of intent, something deliberate and unfinished. The conflict that began to take shape in his mind wasn't yet fully formed, but it was enough to disturb his sense of order, because if the war had truly ended with the fall of Lord Voldemort at the hands of Harry Potter, then why would such carefully preserved items remain, tucked away in the depths of Malfoy Manor, as though waiting for something that had never come? Elric wasn't a man prone to imagination, nor did he indulge in the kind of fear that had once paralyzed much of the wizarding world. Yet he understood better than most that Voldemort had never relied solely on power, but rather on precision, on the quiet weaving of plans that often went unnoticed until it was far too late. And it was precisely this understanding that compelled him to take a closer look. He began with the parchment, expecting nothing more than meaningless scribbles or remnants of failed spells. But instead he discovered something far more unsettling, for the markings, though fragmented and seemingly incoherent at first glance, began to form a pattern when viewed together, as though they were pieces of a larger design that had been intentionally scattered. And when he traced the faint lines with his wand, a soft pulse of magic responded, barely detectable, yet undeniably present. It was not dark magic in the way one might expect, not the violent surge of curses or the oppressive weight of forbidden spells, but something quieter, more insidious, like a thread woven into the fabric of reality itself. And as Elric stepped back, a realization began to take hold, slow and unwelcome, that perhaps these objects had never been meant to act alone, but rather as parts of something greater. The goblet, when touched, emitted the faintest vibration, as though reacting to his presence, while the brooch seemed to grow colder in his hand, its surface shimmering for just a moment with an unnatural sheen, and the broken wand, though useless by all conventional standards, hummed faintly when placed near the parchment, as though it recognized something that Elric himself could not yet see. The conflict was now clear, sharp as a blade drawn in the dark. These were not remnants of a defeated enemy, but fragments of a plan that had never been completed. And if that was true, then the question was no longer whether Voldemort had left something behind, but rather what that something was meant to become. Elric knew that he could not ignore this, not when every instinct he possessed told him that the danger lay not in what was obvious, but in what had been overlooked. And so, gathering the items carefully, he prepared to bring his findings to the Ministry, though a quiet unease followed him as he extinguished the torches and stepped into the corridor, as though the shadows themselves were watching, waiting to see whether he would understand the significance of what he had uncovered. Far away, within the silent halls of Hogwarts, a draught stirred where no window stood open, and for just a fleeting moment, a torch flickered, its flame bending unnaturally before returning to stillness, leaving behind no trace of the disturbance, save for a lingering sense that something, somewhere, had begun to awaken. And though Elric Vane could not yet know it, the smallest detail he had uncovered would soon unravel into a chain of events that would test not only his skill as an Auror, but the very assumption that the war against Voldemort had ever truly ended at all. By the following morning, the uneasy certainty that had settled over Elric Vane in the archive room had not faded with sleep, nor had it softened beneath the ordinary clatter of Ministry life. Because if anything could be said of fear that was earned rather than imagined, it was that it sharpened itself in daylight, becoming less theatrical and more practical, until it resembled not a terror of the unknown, but a list of consequences waiting patiently to unfold. He carried the crate himself through the lower corridors of the Ministry of Magic, taking a route that avoided the busiest departments. For he had no wish to explain his errand to a dozen curious officials whose memories of the war had made them eager to dismiss any new threat as either impossible or inconvenient. And by the time he reached the small consultation chamber adjoining the Office for Magical Evidence Review, the air in the room already felt close and stale, as though the walls had heard too many bad ideas and were bracing for one more. Waiting for him, there was Miriam Strout, a senior curse-breaker on temporary assignment from Gringotts, whose experience with layered enchantments was the sort that inspired confidence even in people who disliked goblins and distrusted anyone who handled ancient magic for a living, because Miriam possessed the rare habit of speaking plainly, doubting everything, and missing almost nothing, which made her a useful ally on any day and an indispensable one on a day such as this. She was standing by the table when Elric entered, her sleeves already rolled and her dark wand resting beside a brass lens that shimmered with diagnostic runes. And although she greeted him with the kind of nod that passed for warmth among professionals who had spent too much of their adult lives around cursed objects, her eyes moved immediately to the crate, then to his face, and in that brief glance she understood enough to ask no foolish questions. Elric laid the items out one by one upon the felt-lined surface, setting the cracked silver goblet nearest the lamp, the tarnished brooch beside it, the scraps of parchment in a neat stack, and the splintered wand at the far edge as though distance alone might lessen whatever influence it held. And only when everything was arranged did he explain what he had felt in the archive, what he had seen in the parchments, and why the pattern had disturbed him more than any openly cursed artifact would have done. Miriam listened without interruption, though once or twice her expression changed in a way so slight that another observer might not have noticed it. And when he had finished, she reached first for the parchment, not touching it with her skin but with a pair of dragonhide tongs, then angled the brass lens over the faded ink, murmuring a sequence of revealing charms so delicate that the air above the table rippled like heat over stone. At first there seemed to be nothing beyond faint traces of notation and fragmented instructions. Yet as the lens turned and the runes on its rim brightened, fine silver lines began to appear between one scrap and another, crossing the gaps where the torn edges did not meet, until the entire arrangement resembled a map incomplete in appearance, yet complete in logic, the kind of pattern a patient mind might leave behind precisely because impatience in others could be relied upon. "Elric," Miriam said at last, her voice lower than before and stripped of all routine confidence. "These are not spell fragments, and they are not ward diagrams either, though they borrow from both, because this is an anchoring sequence." The word fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and Elric felt the meaning before he fully grasped the technical shape of it, because an anchoring sequence was not designed to destroy or to defend, but to hold, to preserve, to maintain a magical condition across distance and time, and the implications of such work in connection with Voldemort were dark enough to turn even a bright room dim. He asked the question already forming in his mind, though he dreaded the answer even as he gave it voice, and Miriam, instead of replying at once, moved her wand above the goblet and whispered a charm so narrow in purpose that Elric did not recognize it, after which the silver surface clouded, then cleared, revealing for a moment the faint outline of a mark not engraved into the metal, but suspended inside it like a memory trapped in ice. "There," she said, and pointed not at the mark itself, but at the way it shifted when the parchment lay near, because the symbol altered by the width of a hair, correcting itself in response to the writing, as though one item completed the instructions of the other. Each object answers to a shared design, which means they were made to function as a set even if they were hidden separately, and that is why they feel wrong without appearing dangerous, because the danger exists only when enough of the system is present. Elric looked from the goblet to the brooch, from the brooch to the broken wand, and saw suddenly not a collection of leftovers, but a machine taken apart and disguised as rubbish, and the central conflict of the story that had begun in a dusty archive room now stood before him in unforgiving clarity, for he was no longer investigating whether Voldemort had left behind dark magic, but whether a hidden mechanism of influence, survival, or return had been scattered through the wizarding world in pieces too trivial to alarm anyone until they began, quietly and obediently, to work together. Miriam tested the brooch next, and when her wand tip brushed its tarnished clasp, the lamp on the table guttered so violently that both of them stepped back, while along the edge of the metal there ran for half a second a thread of red light so thin and precise that it seemed less like magic than intention-given shape, after which the clasp clicked open of its own accord. Inside, concealed beneath a fold of darkened silver, was a single line of script no larger than an eyelash, written in a hand so exact that it seemed carved rather than penned. "Detail governs devotion." The words were plain, almost absurdly so, and for that very reason they were more disturbing than any threat might have been, because they sounded not like prophecy or madness, but like instruction, like the private motto of someone who believed utterly that control belonged not to the loudest force, but to the hand that had prepared the smallest mechanism correctly. Elric felt a cold pressure gather at the base of his neck, not from magic alone, but from recognition, because Voldemort had always understood fear as others understood language, yet behind the spectacle of terror, there had always been method, patience, and the careful arrangement of details that made people underestimate the true design until it was already closing around them. They spent the next hour examining the remaining objects, and with each result the same pattern repeated in more troubling form, for the broken wand carried no usable core, and yet reacted to the goblet. The goblet responded to the parchment. The parchment altered when the brooch was opened, and none of them, taken separately, would have justified alarm in a post-war inventory, which meant the plan had been built upon a simple and sinister assumption, namely that victory made people careless. Then, just as Miriam began tracing the outer ring of the anchoring sequence in an effort to determine where the remaining connections might lead, the silver lines across the parchment flared without warning, converging not into a spell or curse, but into a location. For one suspended breath, neither of them spoke. Because the answer was so improbable that the mind resisted it before the eye could deny it. At the center of the glowing pattern, written in letters of pale fire that burned without consuming the page, appeared a single word: Hogwarts. The room seemed to contract around that name, as though all the air had gone suddenly thin, and Elric's thoughts moved at once from objects to corridors, from hidden compartments to classrooms, from students who had known only 1 year of peace to a castle that had already survived one final battle, and might now be asked to endure another, stranger one, shaped not by open siege, but by the slow awakening of something planted in secrecy. Miriam extinguished the glow with a firm countercharm, though the afterimage lingered on the inside of Elric's vision, and when she finally spoke, her tone admitted neither comfort nor doubt. If this sequence is real, then something at Hogwarts is waiting for these anchors to complete a process, and if even one part of that process has already begun, then every hour we spend here is an hour spent behind it. Elric closed the crate, not because the matter was settled, but because it had become urgent, and while the ministry above them went on with its circular memos, its clinking lifts, and its determined performance of normal life, he understood with sudden and terrible certainty that the next stage of the conflict would not be fought in the open halls of government, but in the old castle where too many secrets had once been buried, and where, even now, something small and deliberate had begun to stir. The journey to Hogwarts was not long in distance, yet it carried with it a weight that stretched far beyond the miles, because Elric Vane did not travel as a visitor drawn by curiosity or duty alone, but as a man who now understood that the conflict before him had already taken root in the very place that had once been the heart of resistance against Lord Voldemort, and the knowledge that the castle itself might again become the center of a hidden design filled each passing moment with an urgency that refused to be quieted. He and Miriam Strout arrived not through the grand gates or the winding paths that students knew, but by means of a tightly controlled port key authorized under emergency protocol, one that delivered them to a secluded courtyard where the stones still bore faint marks of the last battle, though they had been carefully repaired to preserve both the structure and the memory, and as Elric stepped onto the familiar ground, he felt not the comfort of a place restored, but the uneasy sense that the past had not fully released its hold. Waiting for them beneath the shadow of a high archway was Minerva McGonagall, whose presence alone carried the authority of 1,000 decisions made under pressure. And although she greeted them with calm precision, there was no mistaking the sharpness in her gaze, for she had seen too much of war to accept half-answers or uncertain warnings, and Elric knew that whatever he said would need to be both clear and immediate. He explained the situation without embellishment, describing the objects recovered from Malfoy Manor, the anchoring sequence revealed by Miriam's analysis, and the final undeniable indication that the pattern converged upon Hogwarts itself. And though McGonagall did not interrupt him, the silence that followed his explanation was heavy with calculation, as though she were already measuring not whether the threat was real, but how deeply it might already have spread. The conflict, Elric concluded, choosing his words with deliberate care, is that these objects are not remnants, but components, and if enough of them are present here, then something is either waiting to be completed or has already begun without our knowledge. McGonagall inclined her head slightly, acknowledging both the gravity of the statement and the absence of certainty that still surrounded it. And when she spoke, her voice carried the steady firmness that had guided the school through its darkest hours. "Then we shall proceed as though the danger is real, because Hogwarts has never had the luxury of assuming otherwise," she said, before turning and leading them into the castle, her robes sweeping softly across the stone, as though the very building recognized her command. The corridors they entered were quiet, though not empty. For the subtle life of the castle continued in its usual rhythms, with distant footsteps echoing faintly and the occasional murmur of voices drifting from unseen rooms. Yet beneath that surface there was something else, something that Elric could not immediately name, a faint tension in the air that might have gone unnoticed by anyone less alert, but which now seemed impossible to ignore. Miriam, walking beside him, kept her wand loosely in hand, not raised in threat, but ready in purpose, and from time to time she paused to cast brief diagnostic charms that flickered across the walls and floors like pale reflections, each one searching for traces of the same subtle magic they had observed in the objects, though at first the results revealed nothing beyond the expected enchantments that had always been part of Hogwarts' ancient structure. They began their search in the most logical locations, examining storage rooms, unused classrooms, and concealed alcoves that might have served as hiding places for objects too insignificant to draw attention. And with each passing hour, the tension grew, not because they found immediate danger, but because the absence of clear evidence suggested that whatever had been hidden was either exceedingly well concealed or already in motion. It was in an old classroom, long since repurposed for storage, that the first true sign appeared, for as Miriam traced the edge of a wooden cabinet with her wand, a faint shimmer passed through the air, so slight that it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light. Yet when she repeated the motion, the shimmer returned, forming a thin, almost invisible thread that extended from the cabinet toward the far wall. "Elric," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same controlled urgency he had heard in the Ministry. "This is not residual magic. This is active." He stepped closer, following the direction of the thread, and as he did, he felt the same subtle pull he had experienced in the archive room, as though the magic itself were aware of his attention, responding not with force but with recognition. And when he reached the wall, he saw nothing at first, only the smooth surface of stone that had stood unchanged for centuries. Yet when he placed his hand against it, the stone shifted. It was not a dramatic movement, nor did it reveal a hidden passage in the manner of the castle's more well-known secrets, but rather a slight adjustment, a careful realignment of edges that exposed a narrow seam, within which lay a small, almost unnoticeable recess, and inside that recess rested an object so ordinary that it might have been dismissed at a glance. It was a simple brass key. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because the discovery was both exactly what they had expected and yet more troubling than they had imagined. For the key bore no markings, no visible enchantments, and no immediate signs of significance. Yet the thread of magic connecting it to the cabinet and, by extension, to the anchoring sequence was unmistakable. "The devil is in the details," Miriam murmured, recalling the words hidden within the brooch, and Elric felt a chill pass through him, not from fear alone, but from the realization that every step they took was being guided by a design that had anticipated both discovery and doubt. The conflict had now deepened, for they were no longer searching for evidence of a hidden plan, but actively uncovering its components. And with each new piece, the structure of that plan became more defined, more deliberate, and more dangerous. McGonagall, who had observed the discovery in silence, stepped forward, and examined the key with a measured gaze, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts, though the tension in her posture spoke clearly enough. "If this is one part of a larger mechanism," she said at last, "then the question is not what it does, but what it is meant to unlock." Elric looked at the key, then at the faint thread of magic that still connected it to unseen points within the castle, and understood with growing certainty that they were no longer ahead of the danger, but moving within it, tracing a path that had been laid long before their arrival, and that somewhere within Hogwarts, a lock existed that had been waiting, patiently and precisely, for this moment to come. The discovery of the brass key did not bring clarity, but rather sharpened the uncertainty into something far more dangerous, because Elric Vane now understood that the conflict he was attempting to resolve was not a matter of locating a single hidden object or dismantling an obvious curse, but of navigating a system that had been designed to reveal itself only in fragments, each piece leading inevitably to the next, until the full structure emerged too late to be easily undone. Within the ancient walls of Hogwarts, where secrets had always found a way to endure long after those who created them had vanished, such a system was particularly well suited to survival, because the castle itself was not merely a building, but a living construct of shifting passages, concealed chambers, and enchantments layered so deeply that even the most experienced witches and wizards could not claim complete understanding of its inner workings. Elric stood in the dim classroom, the brass key resting in his gloved hand, and though its surface remained cold and unremarkable, the faint thread of magic that connected it to unseen points within the castle pulsed with quiet insistence, as though urging him forward, not through force, but through inevitability. And it was this subtlety that troubled him most, for it reflected the precise, controlled nature of Lord Voldemort in a way that brute spells and open violence never could. Miriam Strout, whose patience was matched only by her caution, began tracing the thread with a series of finely tuned detection charms, each one revealing not the destination itself, but the direction in which the connection extended. And as she worked, the path became gradually clearer, winding not through the obvious corridors or well-known chambers, but along routes that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid notice, passing through areas seldom used and spaces that had been forgotten by all but the castle itself. "This is not random," she said at length, her voice low but steady, "because whoever designed this expected interference, which means the sequence is not only hidden, but adaptive, responding to discovery by guiding the investigator deeper rather than stopping altogether." Elric considered this, his thoughts moving quickly through the implications, because if the system was indeed adaptive, then every step they took might be anticipated, every decision subtly influenced by the very magic they were attempting to dismantle, and the conflict before them shifted once again, becoming not merely a race against time, but a contest of understanding against a design that had been crafted to outthink those who sought to unravel it. At the edge of the room, Minerva McGonagall watched in silence, her presence a steady anchor amid the growing tension, and though she spoke little, her attention missed nothing, for she had long ago learned that the smallest detail could determine the outcome of events far larger than it first appeared. And in this moment, that lesson felt more relevant than ever. They followed the thread. It led them out of the classroom and into a narrow corridor where the torches burned lower than elsewhere in the castle, their light flickering against the stone walls in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the shadows themselves were part of the design, guiding perception while concealing truth. And as Elric walked, he felt again that subtle awareness pressing against his senses, not hostile, not overtly threatening, but undeniably present. The thread turned sharply at a junction, slipping past a tapestry that depicted a long-forgotten wizarding council, and continued along a passage that sloped gently downward, the air growing cooler with each step, until they reached a section of the castle that bore little resemblance to the well-kept halls above, where the stone was rougher, the enchantments older, and the silence deeper, as though time itself had slowed in this forgotten place. It was here that the second component revealed itself. Set into the wall at shoulder height was a narrow metal plate, so thin and so carefully aligned with the surrounding stone that it might have been overlooked entirely. Yet when Miriam directed her wand toward it, the faint thread of magic converged upon its surface, illuminating it with a pale glow that outlined its shape with unsettling precision. Elric stepped closer, examining the plate, and saw that it was not solid, but composed of several interlocking segments, each one etched with markings too small to read without magnification. And as he reached out, the brass key in his hand grew slightly warmer, its reaction subtle, yet unmistakable. "This is part of it," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something delicate and dangerous. "But it is not the end, because it is waiting for input." Miriam nodded, her expression focused, as she produced the brass lens from earlier and adjusted it carefully, bringing the tiny markings into sharp relief, and what she saw caused her to pause, not in confusion, but in recognition. "These are alignment runes," she said, her tone precise, "but they are incomplete because they require a specific configuration, something that can only be determined if all the components are present." The conflict deepened further because the system was no longer passive, waiting to be discovered, but interactive, requiring engagement to progress, and that meant that the act of investigation itself could trigger the next stage, advancing the sequence in ways that might not be easily reversed. McGonagall stepped forward, her gaze moving from the plate to the key, then to the faint thread that still extended beyond. And when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had made difficult decisions before, and would do so again without hesitation. "We proceed carefully," she said, "because if this mechanism is designed to be completed, then we must ensure that we understand its purpose before we allow it to move forward." Elric felt the weight of her words settle over him, because he knew that caution alone would not be enough, not when the system itself seemed to demand interaction, and yet to refuse that interaction might leave them blind to the true nature of the threat, and in that balance lay the heart of the conflict he now faced. He looked at the brass key, at the intricate plate, and at the faint, guiding thread that continued deeper into the castle, and understood that they stood at a threshold, not merely of location, but of intention, where the next action would determine whether they remained observers of a hidden design or became participants in its unfolding. And somewhere beyond that threshold, unseen yet unmistakably present, the careful, deliberate work of Lord Voldemort continued to wait, patient as ever for the smallest detail to fall into place. For several long moments no one moved, because there are thresholds that announce themselves with thunder and light, and there are others, far more dangerous, that stand in silence and wait for a single hand, a single thought, a single concession to curiosity. And Elric Vane knew with the sharpened instinct of an Auror who had survived the remnants of war that the metal plate before him belonged to the latter kind, for it did not threaten openly, but invited precision, which in the hands of Lord Voldemort had always been a more perilous instrument than rage. The narrow corridor seemed to draw inward around them, while the torches behind cast a wavering light that did not quite reach the plate itself, leaving its fine interlocking segments caught in a dim sheen like scales beneath shallow water. And when Miriam Strout adjusted the brass lens once more, the runes on its rim brightened and trembled, revealing tiny carvings within the grooves. Marks so exquisitely small that they could not have been placed there without both extraordinary patience and a certainty that almost no one would ever think to look. Elric raised the brass key and held it near the plate without touching it, whereupon the warmth in the metal deepened, spreading into his glove and then through his fingers with an unsettling steadiness. And in answer, the etched segments shifted by the breadth of a fingernail, reordering themselves in silence until they formed not a lock, as he had expected, but a sequence of symbols that resembled a partial instruction rather than a mechanism. "It is guiding us," Miriam said, though her voice held no relief, because guidance in matters such as these could be as dangerous as concealment. And that means the system is meant to be completed by someone intelligent enough to follow the steps, but perhaps not cautious enough to question why. McGonagall's gaze remained fixed upon the plate, her expression stern and unreadable. Yet Elric could sense in her the same dreadful understanding that pressed upon his own thoughts, namely that the conflict they were attempting to resolve had changed once again, for they were no longer merely uncovering an unfinished design hidden in forgotten corners of Hogwarts, but confronting a structure built to make its own discovery part of its activation, which meant that every clue could be both evidence and trap, every answer both warning and invitation. The key, still suspended in Elric's hand, gave a faint pulse, and one of the symbols on the plate brightened. Then another, then a third. The sequence continued until 6 signs shone pale against the metal, their forms old and angular and deeply familiar to Miriam, who leaned closer and let out a quiet breath through her teeth. "These are not words," she said, "but conditional markers, pieces of a binding instruction, and they refer to place, blood memory, intent, witness, repetition, and restoration." Elric turned to her at once, because there was enough in those 6 terms to chill any sensible mind, and especially the last of them, for restoration was not a concept that belonged comfortably in the shadow of Voldemort, whose every contingency had been concerned not with legacy, but with return. "Restoration of what?" he asked. "That," Miriam replied, "is exactly what the remaining sequence would tell us, and that is why it has been divided." Before Elric could speak again, the plate made a faint sound, like the click of a distant latch, and from one of the seams between its interlocking pieces, there slid a strip of dark material, no longer than a quill feather, which protruded just enough to be grasped, as though the mechanism had rewarded correct proximity with the next fragment of its own design. The object was a ribbon of blackened vellum. Elric hesitated only a moment before taking it, for to leave it half withdrawn seemed no safer than touching it, and the instant his fingers closed around it, a rush of cold passed through the corridor. Not violent and not loud, but intimate, like the sudden breath of a room long sealed and newly opened. The torches dipped. The walls shivered. Somewhere far above them, from a distant and unidentifiable part of the castle, came the brief echo of moving stone. Then the silence returned. McGonagall lifted her wand at once and cast a stabilizing charm down both ends of the corridor, strengthening the air itself against stray enchantment, while Miriam snatched the vellum from Elric's hand and placed it flat beneath the lens before any further reaction could take place. And there, under magnification, appeared a line of script so fine that the naked eye would have mistaken it for a flaw in the material. "Not all doors are made to open. Some are made to remember." The words settled over them with a weight out of all proportion to their size, and Elric felt, with sudden and terrible clarity, what sort of plan he was standing inside, because this was no direct attempt to raise Voldemort bodily from death, nor some crude echo of Horcrux work, for that chapter of darkness had ended in fire and ruin, but rather a different form of survival altogether, one rooted in the preservation of method, influence, and will, as though the Dark Lord, anticipating even the destruction of his soul's fragments, had sought to leave behind a sequence capable of reawakening not his body, but the architecture of his power. He spoke the thought aloud, and as soon as he did so, Miriam's face hardened in agreement. "A pattern of restoration," she said, "not of flesh, but of system, which means these anchors may be designed to reconstruct magical conditions that once served him, perhaps even to create a channel through which his remaining influence can act again where memory, fear, or old enchantments still linger." The conflict before them was now plain and dreadful in equal measure, because if Voldemort had hidden within Hogwarts not a weapon, but a framework designed to restore the mechanisms of his control, then the danger lay not in a single explosion of dark magic, but in the slow corruption of place itself, in the possibility that the castle could be made to remember him in ways that would shape thought, weaken judgment, and prepare the ground for something even worse. It was at that moment that footsteps sounded at the far end of the passage. All three turned at once, wands ready, yet the figure approaching was not hostile, but frightened, for it was a student, a boy no older than 14, wearing Hufflepuff robes and carrying a stack of books held too tightly against his chest, as though he had been sent by chance into a corridor where chance had no business to be. He stopped the instant he saw them, eyes wide, and for a brief moment Elric considered simply sending him away with the first plausible excuse. But then he noticed something in the boy's expression that made him still. "You should not be here," McGonagall said firmly, though not unkindly. "I know, Headmistress," the boy replied, swallowing hard. "But I was looking for the charms storage room because Professor Flitwick asked for the old index of shield variations, and I thought this was the quicker corridor, only—" He faltered and glanced past them toward the wall with the plate. "Only it has been happening again." Elric took one step forward. "What has been happening?" The boy shifted the books in his arms and answered with the embarrassed seriousness of someone afraid of sounding foolish, and yet more afraid of remaining silent. "For the last 3 nights, when I pass this part of the castle, I hear someone whispering the same sentence, always very quietly, and always as if they are standing right behind me, though whenever I turn there is no one there." Miriam and Elric exchanged a look. "What sentence?" Elric asked. The boy licked dry lips, then recited it exactly, as though he had heard it too often to mistake a syllable. "Mind the smallest thing." No one spoke after that, because the message was too deliberate, too closely aligned with everything they had already discovered, and because its presence here, repeated to a student by a corridor that should not have been speaking at all, confirmed the worst of their growing fears, namely that the sequence was no longer dormant. McGonagall gently dismissed the boy, altering his route and sending him back toward safer halls, with instructions to speak of this to no one for the present. And only when his footsteps had faded entirely did she turn back to Elric and Miriam, her face set with the cold resolve of someone who understood the scale of what was unfolding. "It has begun to affect the castle," she said, and there was no uncertainty left in her voice now. "Which means the matter is more advanced than we thought, and if Hogwarts is already remembering, then whatever this mechanism is meant to restore may already be taking hold." Elric looked once more at the black vellum, at the plate, at the patient thread of magic that still extended deeper into the unseen structure of the school, and understood that they had passed beyond investigation into resistance, because the hidden design was no longer waiting to be found. It was waking. The realization that the castle itself had begun to respond, not merely as a setting in which events occurred, but as a participant in the unfolding design, altered the nature of the conflict in a way that no single discovery could have achieved, because Elric Vane now understood that he was no longer tracing a hidden mechanism from the outside, but standing within a system that had already begun to activate. And that meant every corridor, every wall, every echo of sound might now serve a purpose that was neither benign nor easily understood. The narrow passage where they stood seemed to deepen in silence, as though the very stones had withdrawn into themselves, listening rather than speaking. And though the torches still burned, their light had taken on a subdued quality that made shadows stretch farther than they should, lingering just long enough to suggest movement where none could be confirmed, which in a place like Hogwarts was never a detail to be dismissed. Miriam Strout folded the strip of black vellum with deliberate care and slipped it into a warded case, her expression sharpened not by fear, but by a precise and growing understanding of the pattern they were confronting, for she had spent years dismantling ancient constructs built by minds that trusted complexity over force. And what she saw here was not a reckless contingency, but a design that relied upon patience, repetition, and the assumption that most people would stop looking too soon. "This is no longer about locating the remaining components," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that threaded through it, "because the system has moved beyond concealment into operation, and that means our objective must shift from discovery to disruption." Elric nodded, though the simplicity of her conclusion concealed the difficulty of its execution, for to disrupt a system one had not yet fully mapped was to risk triggering the very outcome one sought to prevent. And the conflict he now faced was no longer merely intellectual or investigative, but immediate and active, requiring decisions that could not be delayed without consequence. Minerva McGonagall stepped forward, her wand raised not in alarm but in readiness, and with a swift, practiced motion, she cast a series of reinforcing charms along the corridor, weaving a lattice of stabilizing magic that shimmered briefly before settling into invisibility, anchoring the space against further subtle shifts. "We must assume that the castle's enchantments are being influenced rather than overwritten," she said, her tone measured yet resolute, "because Hogwarts does not yield easily, and if something has found a way to guide its responses, then that influence must be delicate, precise, and deeply embedded." Elric listened carefully, because within her words lay both warning and opportunity. For if the system depended upon subtle influence rather than brute domination, then it might be vulnerable to equally precise interference, though such interference would require not only skill, but a clear understanding of where to apply it. The faint thread of magic that had guided them thus far still extended beyond the metal plate, though it now pulsed more distinctly, as though aware of their attention. And when Miriam turned her lens toward it, the runes flickered with a new intensity, revealing additional branches that had not been visible before, spreading outward like the veins of a leaf, connecting points within the castle that formed a pattern too complex to grasp at a glance. "It is expanding," she said quietly. "Or rather, it is revealing connections that were previously dormant, which suggests that each component we uncover strengthens the system's coherence, bringing more of its structure into alignment." Elric felt the weight of that truth settle heavily upon him, because it confirmed what he had begun to suspect, namely that their progress was not neutral, but participatory, each discovery feeding the system even as it brought them closer to understanding it. And that meant the conflict had become a paradox, where knowledge itself might serve the design they were attempting to dismantle. "Then we cannot continue as we have been," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty that pressed at the edges of his thoughts. "Because if every step forward strengthens the pattern, then we must find a way to break it without completing it." Miriam lowered the lens and met his gaze, and for a moment the two of them stood in shared recognition of the difficulty before them. For to break a pattern required identifying its critical points, the places where disruption would cascade through the system rather than merely altering its surface, and in a structure as intricate as this, such points would not be obvious. McGonagall considered their words in silence, her expression thoughtful yet unyielding, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet authority of decision. "The key," she said, glancing at the brass object still held by Elric, "was not hidden to be found at random, but placed to be discovered in sequence, which means it is not merely a component, but a trigger. And if that is so, then its use must be controlled, not avoided." Elric looked down at the key, its surface now faintly warm, and felt again the subtle pulse that had guided him before, though now it seemed less like an invitation and more like a demand, as though the system required his participation to advance. And in that demand lay both danger and possibility. "You are suggesting that we use it," he said. "I am suggesting," McGonagall replied, "that we choose how it is used, rather than allowing the system to dictate that choice for us." The distinction was slight in wording, yet vast in implication, for it transformed their role from reactive to deliberate, from followers of a hidden path to agents capable of shaping its outcome, though such agency came with risk, because a misstep could bring them not closer to resolution, but directly into the mechanism they sought to disrupt. Miriam stepped back toward the metal plate, her movements careful and precise, and gestured for Elric to approach. "If the key is indeed a trigger," she said, "then its interaction with the plate will reveal the next stage of the sequence, and if we are to intervene effectively, we must see that stage clearly, no matter the cost." The air in the corridor seemed to tighten as Elric moved forward, each step measured, each breath controlled, and when he raised the key toward the plate, the faint thread of magic flared, its glow spreading along the seams of the metal until the entire surface shimmered with a pale, steady light. For a moment he hesitated, not from fear, but from the awareness that this action would mark a point of no return, a deliberate engagement with a design that had already proven its capacity for subtlety and control, and yet the alternative, to stand still while the system continued to unfold unseen, was no longer acceptable. The conflict demanded action. And so, with a steady hand, Elric Vane placed the brass key against the plate. The reaction was immediate. The interlocking segments shifted with a sound like distant stone grinding against stone, aligning themselves into a new configuration, while the glow intensified, spreading beyond the plate and into the walls, tracing hidden lines that extended in all directions, illuminating a network that had been concealed within the very structure of the castle. For an instant, the corridor seemed to exist in two states at once, the familiar stone overlaying a deeper pattern of luminous connections, each one pulsing with the same quiet intent that had guided them thus far. And at the center of this pattern, just beyond the reach of immediate sight, there was a convergence point, a place where all threads seemed to lead. Then the light faded. The plate returned to stillness, and the key grew cold once more. No explosion followed, no immediate danger manifested, yet the silence that settled over the corridor was heavier than before, filled with the unspoken understanding that something had changed. Not in appearance, but in state, as though a door had been opened not in space, but in possibility. Miriam lowered her wand slowly, her eyes still fixed on the place where the pattern had been visible. "We have just advanced the sequence," she said, her voice calm but edged with urgency, "and whatever lies at its center is now one step closer to activation." Elric closed his hand around the key, its surface inert once more, and turned his gaze toward the unseen convergence point, feeling the weight of the next decision already pressing upon him. The conflict had deepened beyond all doubt, and the path ahead, though still hidden, was now undeniably open. For a long and measured span of silence after the activation of the metal plate, none of them spoke, because there are moments when language itself feels insufficient against the weight of what has been set in motion, and Elric Vane, standing within the dim corridor of Hogwarts, understood with an unsettling clarity that the conflict he had undertaken was no longer contained within hidden compartments or fragmented objects, but had spread into the living fabric of the castle, where every stone and passage might now serve a purpose beyond its original design. The faint glow that had traced the unseen network of connections had faded from sight, yet its impression remained etched into his thoughts, a memory too precise to be dismissed, showing lines that converged with deliberate intent toward a central point buried somewhere within the depths of the school. And it was toward this unseen convergence that his attention now turned. Not because he wished to follow it blindly, but because the pattern itself demanded resolution. Miriam Strout was the first to move, her mind already working through the implications of what they had witnessed, as she raised her wand and began casting a series of stabilizing and isolating charms, each one designed to prevent the immediate spread of the system's influence within the corridor. Though even as the spells took hold, it was clear that they addressed only the surface, not the deeper structure that had revealed itself moments before. "This is no longer a localized construct," she said, her voice calm but carrying a tension that betrayed the seriousness of her conclusion, "because the network we saw extends beyond any single chamber or corridor, which means the anchors are already linked, forming a complete pattern that exists throughout the castle, even if its full function has not yet been realized." Elric nodded, though the acknowledgement brought him little comfort, because the conflict had now expanded beyond a manageable scope, transforming from a contained investigation into a race against a system that had already begun to assemble itself. And the question that pressed upon him was no longer how many components remained undiscovered, but how close the sequence was to completion. Minerva McGonagall stepped forward, her expression set with a firm resolve that had carried her through darker days than these. And though the situation before them was complex and uncertain, there was no hesitation in her posture, only the quiet determination of someone who understood that delay would serve no purpose but to strengthen the threat. "We must reach the convergence point," she said, her voice steady and authoritative, "because if that is where the sequence is meant to complete, then it is also where it can be undone. Provided we arrive before the final stage is triggered." Elric considered her words carefully, because while the logic was sound, the risk was undeniable. For to move toward the center of such a system was to enter the place where its influence would be strongest, and yet to remain at the edges was to concede the initiative entirely, allowing the sequence to proceed without interference. "The thread will guide us," he said at last, though even as he spoke, he was aware that following it meant accepting the terms set by the design itself. But we must be prepared for resistance, not in the form of direct attack, but in the way the castle may respond to our presence. Miriam inclined her head in agreement, her gaze already shifting toward the direction in which the faint magical thread now pulsed with greater intensity, its presence no longer subtle but insistent, as though the system, having been advanced, now sought to draw them onward with a clarity that bordered on command. They moved together, leaving the corridor behind, and entering a series of passages that twisted and descended in ways that defied the straightforward logic of architecture, leading them through parts of the castle that were rarely used, where the air was cooler and the enchantments older, layered with centuries of magic that had shaped and reshaped the space in ways no single mind could fully comprehend. As they walked, Elric became increasingly aware of changes that could not be dismissed as coincidence, for the castle itself seemed to shift in subtle ways, doors that should have remained closed standing slightly ajar. Staircases altering their direction by the smallest degree, and distant sounds echoing at odd intervals, as though the structure were adjusting to their movement, guiding them along a path that had been prepared long before their arrival. "This is deliberate," Miriam said quietly, her eyes scanning the surroundings with careful precision, "because the system is using the castle's own properties to facilitate movement toward the center, which means we are not forcing our way through but being allowed to proceed." Elric felt a chill at that realization, because it confirmed that they were no longer intruders in a hidden design, but participants in its execution. And that meant the conflict had entered its most dangerous phase, where intention and outcome were no longer clearly separated. At one point, they passed through a narrow archway that opened into a small chamber lined with old stone benches, a place that might once have served as a waiting room or a minor gathering space. Yet, as they crossed its threshold, Elric felt a sudden and distinct shift in the air, as though they had stepped into a space where the system's influence was more concentrated. He stopped at once, raising his hand to signal the others, and for a moment they stood in silence, listening not for sound, but for the subtle presence of magic that now seemed to gather around them with quiet intensity. Then, from the far wall, a whisper emerged. It was not loud, nor was it directed at any one of them, but rather seemed to exist within the space itself, a soft repetition of words that carried no urgency, yet demanded attention all the same. "Mind the smallest thing." The phrase echoed faintly, repeating with a rhythm that was almost natural, as though it had always belonged to the chamber, and Elric felt a tightening in his chest as he recognized it, not merely as a warning, but as a principle, a guiding concept that lay at the heart of the system they were confronting. "It is reinforcing itself," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper, "embedding the idea into the environment, ensuring that those who encounter it cannot easily dismiss its significance." McGonagall stepped forward, her wand raised, and with a precise motion she cast a dispersal charm, the magic flaring briefly as it sought to break the repetition. And for a moment the whisper faltered, its rhythm disrupted, yet it did not vanish entirely, instead fading to a level just below perception, where it could no longer be clearly heard, but might still be felt. "We do not engage with it," she said firmly, lowering her wand, "because whatever influence it carries is meant to guide thought, and we must remain outside that guidance if we are to act freely." Elric nodded, though he knew that resisting such influence would require constant vigilance, for the system's strength lay not in overwhelming force, but in subtle suggestion, shaping perception in ways that might not be immediately recognized. They moved on. The path grew narrower, the air colder, and the thread of magic brighter, leading them deeper into the hidden structure of the castle, until at last they reached a heavy door set into a wall of dark stone, its surface unmarked and its presence so unassuming that it might have been mistaken for nothing more than part of the architecture. Yet, as Elric approached, the key in his hand stirred once more, its warmth returning with a steady pulse, and the faint network of magic around them seemed to converge upon this point with undeniable focus. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Or at least the next stage." Miriam stepped beside him, her expression tense but controlled, while McGonagall took position just behind, her presence a silent assurance that whatever lay beyond the door would be met with resolve. The conflict had reached a critical juncture, where the path forward could no longer be avoided or delayed, and as Elric raised the key toward the door, he understood that whatever awaited them on the other side would not merely reveal the purpose of the system, but determine whether they could still prevent its completion. The castle fell silent, and the key moved toward the lock that could not yet be seen. For one suspended instant, which seemed to hang outside ordinary time like a bead of water trembling from the edge of a leaf before it falls, Elric Vane stood before the unmarked door with the brass key lifted in his hand, while the silence of the passage gathered around him with such complete stillness that even the castle, which was never truly quiet in any season or hour, appeared to be holding its breath in expectation of what would follow. The door itself offered no visible keyhole, no inscription, no decorative ironwork, and no outward sign that it was meant to yield to anything at all. Yet the warmth rising through the brass key had become unmistakable, steady and deliberate, not the random flare of disturbed magic, but the controlled response of one piece of a system brought at last into the presence of another. And Elric understood with growing certainty that the conflict he had been chasing through parchments, compartments, and whispering corridors had now narrowed to a single threshold. Miriam Strout stepped closer, lifting her wand so that its light spread thinly across the stone, and under that pale illumination, the surface of the door altered almost imperceptibly, for faint lines emerged beneath the dustless dark, running in circles so fine and exact that they resembled the rings hidden within old wood, except that these had not grown by nature, but had been placed by craft, one within another, until the whole door resembled the face of a sealed device, waiting for the final detail to complete its design. "Do not force anything," Miriam said, though the warning was hardly needed, because Elric had no wish to offer this mechanism more than it required, and no doubt that it had been built to punish impatience in ways subtler than curses, and perhaps more lasting. A system like this accepts precision and resists intrusion, which means that if you place the key where it wishes to be placed, it will reveal the next instruction, but if you attempt to outguess it, we may trigger the sequence in a form we cannot control. McGonagall said nothing, yet her presence behind them was as firm as the walls themselves, and Elric took a measured breath before moving the key closer to the stone, whereupon the hidden circles brightened one by one in dull silver, traveling inward until they reached a point slightly left of center, where a small indentation appeared in the surface, so gradually that it seemed not to open, but to remember that it had once been open before. The key slid into place without resistance. At once the circles began to turn. They did not rotate as gears do, with noise and visible effort, but glided over one another in noiseless alignment, each ring shifting by fractions so minute that the eye could scarcely follow them, while between their moving edges letters formed and dissolved, fragments of words appearing only to vanish again, as though the door were thinking its way through a language too old for haste. Then the motion ceased. A seam opened down the middle, and beyond it there lay not a chamber in the ordinary sense, but a narrow stair of black stone descending into a darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb even wandlight instead of reflecting it. No gust of foul air emerged from below, no hidden guardian leapt forward, and no theatrical menace declared itself, which was precisely why the place was unnerving, for Voldemort had always understood that the most dangerous trap was the one that appeared orderly, intentional, and reasonable, because such things lured the mind into cooperation before fear had a chance to harden it against them. Elric withdrew the key, and the door remained open. "He wants us to go down," he said quietly, and as soon as the words were spoken, he regretted how true they sounded. "Not once," Miriam replied, her eyes fixed on the stair. "Expects, because this entire system has been shaped around the assumption that a careful mind will follow a careful trail, and in that assumption lies the whole structure of the danger." Yet there was nothing for it but to continue, because the conflict now demanded resolution at its source, and to halt upon the threshold would mean leaving the awakened sequence intact behind them, spreading through the castle by degrees too subtle to alarm most people until it had already become part of the place. So they descended. The stair turned tightly, then straightened, then turned again, carrying them deeper beneath Hogwarts than Elric had ever gone, deeper perhaps than any living professor knew to be necessary, until the stone changed beneath their feet and lost the familiar character of the castle's upper foundations, becoming smoother, darker, and older, as though they had passed out of the school's known architecture and into a buried intention concealed beneath it like a second skeleton. At the foot of the stairs lay a circular chamber. Its ceiling rose in a low dome, ribbed with thin metallic bands, while the floor had been inlaid with concentric designs of silver and obsidian so exact that they looked less like decoration than the diagram of a thought. And around the circumference stood 12 narrow recesses cut into the wall, of which only 5 were occupied. In one rested a cracked silver goblet. In another, the tarnished brooch. In a third, a fragmentary wand of useless appearance and undeniable purpose. In the fourth lay a folded strip of blackened vellum. And in the fifth stood a small brass object Elric did not recognize at once, though its proportions suggested some ordinary instrument of school or household use, made strange only by being here. The remaining 7 recesses were empty. Miriam's expression hardened the moment she saw the arrangement, because the meaning of it was too clear to ignore. 12 stations, she said, her voice low and precise, and only 5 are filled, which means the sequence is incomplete, but not dormant, because the structure is already active enough to call its components home. Elric stepped no farther at first, for at the center of the floor there was a pedestal no higher than his knee, carved from the same black stone as the stair, and upon that pedestal rested nothing at all. Yet around its circular top ran an inscription in letters so fine that one had to lean close to read them. He did so, and felt the temperature of the chamber fall as his eyes took in the words. What is repeated becomes remembered. What is remembered becomes permitted. A slow chill passed through him, not merely because the message was sinister, but because it clarified the purpose of the entire design more plainly than any fragment had yet done. For this was a mechanism of restoration through repetition, a system meant to teach the castle itself a pattern of response, until that pattern became normal, accepted, and therefore powerful, which meant that Voldemort had attempted not to live again in flesh, but to train the environment of Hogwarts into habits that favored secrecy, obedience, fear, and perhaps even a future bearer of his methods. He was trying to rebuild conditions, Elric said, speaking his realization as much to steady it as to share it. Not a body, not a soul fragment, but a structure of permission, so that the place would begin by repeating his logic and end by accepting it. McGonagall's face, stern a moment before, became colder still. To teach Hogwarts to make room for him, she said, and there was such controlled anger in her tone that even the chamber seemed to withdraw from it. To turn memory into accommodation. The conflict was now fully unveiled. They were not there to stop a resurrection in the crude sense feared by most survivors of the war, but to prevent the school from being quietly conditioned into an instrument hospitable to the return of Voldemort's methods, influence, and chosen kind of power, which was in some ways worse, because it attacked not life, but judgment, and sought to alter the moral instincts of a place where generations had been formed. Miriam began to circle the room, wand raised, reading the lines of the floor, and with every step her concern deepened, because the 5 occupied recesses were not inert storage points, but active nodes, each sending fine currents of magic toward the central pedestal, where those currents braided together and disappeared into the empty air above it. "It is building a field," she said, "a conceptual one as much as a magical one, and the missing 7 pieces are not merely absent because the system is compensating for them through environmental repetition, which explains the whispers in the corridors, the subtle shifts in passageways, and the influence on students, all of which serve as substitutes until the remaining anchors can be found or imitated." Elric turned sharply toward her. "Then we do not have as much time as we thought." "No," she answered, and for the first time since the Ministry Archive, there was nothing measured about her certainty. "We have less." As if in answer to those words, the central pedestal emitted a thin ring of pale light that rose into the air and expanded outward like a breath made visible, touching each wall recess in turn. And when it passed the empty ones, faint ghost images appeared within them, transparent outlines of objects not yet present but already anticipated by the sequence. A quill, a chain, a small mirror, a student's badge, a bit of chalk, a lock of hair bound in thread, and last of all, a narrow book clasp. The images faded, but their meaning remained. The system was naming its absences. Miriam swore softly under her breath, which was more alarming than any louder reaction would have been. And McGonagall stepped toward the pedestal with sudden purpose. "If it is identifying the remaining anchors," she said, "then it is already reaching for them through the castle, which means ordinary objects may begin to answer the pattern without their owners understanding why." Elric felt the truth of that at once, because each of those items was precisely the sort of thing no one would notice until too late. Objects handled daily by students and teachers, trivial enough to escape scrutiny, and therein lay the dreadful brilliance of the design. For the devil was indeed in the details, and the details at Hogwarts were innumerable. Then, from somewhere above them, muffled by stone and distance yet unmistakable in its urgency, came the sound of a bell ringing once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. McGonagall looked up sharply. "That is the staff alarm," she said. Elric's pulse tightened. Something had happened elsewhere in the castle. And as the pale lines on the floor brightened in response, he knew with cold certainty that whatever had happened wasn't separate from this chamber, but the next movement in the same waking design. The alarm bell's echo did not fade as an ordinary sound would have done, diminishing into silence as distance consumed it, but instead seemed to linger within the very stone above them, repeating in softened reverberations that carried a sense of urgency far greater than its simple tone, and Elric Vane felt at once that the conflict, which had until now been contained within the hidden structure beneath Hogwarts, had begun to spill outward into the living, breathing body of the castle itself. Minerva McGonagall turned without hesitation, her robes sweeping sharply as she moved toward the stair, for she understood better than anyone present that the alarm was not a matter to be observed from afar, but a call that demanded immediate response. Yet before she could ascend more than a single step, Miriam Strout raised her wand and spoke with controlled urgency. "If we leave now without stabilizing this chamber, the sequence will continue to draw strength from the anchors already in place, and whatever has triggered the alarm above may be part of that same progression," she said, her voice firm despite the tension that now filled the room. "Which means we must divide our efforts, or risk losing both fronts at once." Elric felt the weight of that decision settle upon him with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, because the conflict had reached a stage where time could not be spent in careful deliberation, and the path forward demanded both action and trust. And so he stepped forward, his gaze moving from the pedestal to the occupied recesses, then back to Miriam. "You remain here, and disrupt what you can without completing the pattern," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency pressing against it. "And I will go with Professor McGonagall to see what has been triggered above, because if the system is reaching outward, then we must prevent it from securing new anchors." Miriam met his gaze for a brief moment, measuring not only his words, but the intent behind them. And then she nodded once, sharply, accepting both the necessity and the risk. "Do not engage with anything that appears trivial," she said, her tone precise, "because the system is built upon the assumption that such things will be overlooked, and if it is already manifesting anchors through ordinary objects, then the smallest item may carry the greatest significance." Elric inclined his head in acknowledgement, and with that, he and McGonagall turned and began their ascent, leaving behind the dim chamber where the 5 anchors pulsed with quiet, deliberate intent, their influence now unmistakably active. The climb upward seemed longer than it had been on the descent, though Elric knew this was not a matter of distance but of urgency, for every step carried the knowledge that the situation above was unfolding even as they moved, and when they emerged once more into the twisting corridors of the castle, the change in atmosphere was immediate and undeniable. The air itself felt charged. Students' voices, normally contained within classrooms or echoing faintly through the halls, now rose in scattered fragments of confusion and concern, while the distant sound of hurried footsteps suggested that the alarm had already set the staff into motion. Yet beneath all of this, there was something else. Something subtler and far more troubling, a faint undercurrent of whispering that threaded through the noise like a second layer of sound. "Mind the smallest thing." The phrase repeated again, not loudly, not even clearly, but with enough consistency that it could not be dismissed as imagination, and Elric felt a tightening in his chest as he realized that the system was no longer confined to hidden chambers or isolated corridors, but had begun to permeate the daily life of the castle. They reached the main corridor outside the Charms classroom, where a small crowd of students had gathered, their attention fixed upon a single point near the wall. And as McGonagall approached, her presence alone was enough to part the group, revealing the source of the disturbance. A first-year student stood trembling beside a small wooden desk that had been placed in the corridor. Its surface covered with ordinary school supplies, including quills, parchment, ink bottles, and a single piece of chalk that lay at the center, unmoving yet somehow drawing all attention toward it. "What has happened here?" McGonagall asked, her voice firm yet calm, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. One of the older students stepped forward, speaking quickly. "The chalk started writing by itself, Professor," he said, his tone a mixture of awe and fear. "And it keeps repeating the same thing, no matter how many times we try to stop it." Oi! Elric stepped closer, his focus narrowing on the chalk, and as he did, he saw that the surface of the desk was marked with a single line, written over and over again in neat, precise script. "Detail governs devotion." The words were identical to those hidden within the brooch, and their presence here, repeated by an object as mundane as a piece of chalk, confirmed beyond any doubt that the system had begun to replicate its anchors through the environment, using whatever was available to reinforce its pattern. The conflict had now fully emerged into the open, no longer hidden in fragments or confined to secret chambers, but actively shaping the behavior of objects and spaces within Hogwarts, and if left unchecked, it would continue to spread, embedding its logic deeper into the castle with each repetition. "Elric," McGonagall said quietly, her gaze fixed on the chalk. "This is one of the missing anchors." He nodded, though the realization brought no sense of progress, only urgency, because the presence of this anchor meant that the sequence was advancing even without their direct involvement, compensating for its missing components by adapting to the environment, and if it could do so here, it could do so anywhere within the castle. He raised his wand slowly, careful not to startle the object or disrupt the pattern in a way that might accelerate it, and spoke a containment charm designed to isolate the chalk from its surroundings. And for a moment the writing faltered, the movement of the chalk slowing as though encountering resistance. Then, with a sudden and deliberate motion, it resumed. The words continued. "Detail governs devotion." Elric felt a cold realization settle over him, because the system was not merely animating objects, but sustaining them through a deeper connection, one that could not be severed by simple containment, and that meant the anchor was already linked to the larger network beneath the castle. "We cannot destroy it directly," he said, his voice low but certain, "because it is not acting independently, but as part of the sequence, and if we break it without understanding its connection, we may trigger a response elsewhere." McGonagall considered this for a brief moment, then turned to the gathered students, her expression firm. "Return to your dormitories at once," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "and do not touch anything you find unusual, no matter how insignificant it may seem." The students dispersed quickly, their earlier curiosity replaced by unease, and as the corridor emptied, Elric and McGonagall stood alone before the desk, the chalk continuing its quiet, relentless writing. Somewhere below them, in the hidden chamber, the sequence was strengthening. And here, in the open halls of Hogwarts, it had begun to take hold. For several moments after the last of the students had retreated from the corridor, the only sound that remained was the faint and maddening scrape of the chalk against the wooden desk, for it moved with no haste and no uncertainty, pausing only long enough to begin the line again before continuing its neat repetition, as though the phrase it inscribed were not a message, but a discipline, something to be practiced until it ceased to feel foreign and became instead the natural rhythm of thought. Elric Vane stood with his wand raised, though not in the posture of attack, because everything he had learned since opening the crate in the Ministry Archive had taught him that this conflict could not be resolved by striking at the first visible sign of danger, for visible signs were merely the blossoms of a root system buried elsewhere. And if the root remained alive, then each severed branch would only be replaced by another, perhaps subtler, perhaps more deeply hidden, and therefore harder to reach in time. McGonagall moved to the window at the end of the corridor, and with a swift motion sealed the shutters and laid a quieting charm across the hall, not because she feared that sound would spread the enchantment, but because concentration was now worth more than ceremony, and when she turned back, the stern intelligence in her face had sharpened into something colder, which Elric recognized as the particular expression of a witch who has accepted the full seriousness of an unfolding threat and has no further use for doubt. "It is teaching by repetition," she said, and her voice, though low, carried through the corridor with perfect clarity. "Which means the castle is not merely being used as a container for dark magic, but as a medium through which the same narrow instructions may be impressed again and again until they begin to influence choice, habit, and expectation. Which is precisely how institutions are altered without anyone noticing the exact moment at which they ceased to be what they once were. Elric looked again at the chalk, then at the line that had been written dozens of times, and understood more plainly than before what the hidden chamber below had been meant to accomplish. Because Voldemort's final design had not sought spectacle, nor even immediate fear, but a patient corruption of patterns, a training of space, object, and mind toward certain responses, so that the next generation to walk these halls might find themselves moving within arrangements of thought they had never consciously accepted. The conflict, therefore, was no longer only to prevent the completion of the 12 anchors, but to stop the castle from learning the lesson those anchors were teaching. He stepped closer to the desk and cast a more delicate spell than the previous containment charm. One he had learned while dealing with cursed heirlooms that attached themselves to households not by raw magical strength, but by insistence. And at once the chalk shivered, rose upright upon one end, and began to tremble as though some invisible current were being drawn out through the wand light and into the air. For a heartbeat, Elric believed the charm might succeed. Then the desk itself answered. The grain of the wood darkened in twisting lines, and from beneath the repeated sentence there emerged older letters, burned rather than written, as though the surface had held a second inscription all along and was now being compelled to reveal it. Correction begins with the unnoticed. McGonagall inhaled sharply, not in fear, but in sudden recognition, and Elric felt the floor beneath his boots give the faintest pulse. As if far below them the hidden network had acknowledged the phrase and adjusted itself in response. "We are not dealing with 12 independent anchors," he said, the realization arriving whole and hard. "We are dealing with 12 principles, each attached to an object because objects travel through ordinary life more easily than ideas do. But the true design is conceptual, and every repetition strengthens not merely the object, but the principle it carries." McGonagall came to stand beside him, her eyes fixed on the desk as if she might, by sheer force of intellect, look through its surface and down into the machinery of intent beneath the castle. "Then the missing items we saw in the chamber are not important because of what they are," she said, speaking the thought as she shaped it, "but because of where they belong in school life, because a quill influences writing, chalk influences teaching, a badge influences rank, a mirror influences self-perception, and so on, until ordinary acts begin to occur within a framework prepared by him." Elric nodded, and in that moment the whole pattern came into dreadful focus. For Voldemort had chosen not relics of grandeur, but things that passed through hands every day, unnoticed and unquestioned, and had built his design around them precisely because the ordinary enters life more deeply than the extraordinary ever can. Before either could speak further, hurried footsteps sounded from the opposite stair, and a breathless Professor Flitwick appeared around the turn, his wand lit and his usually bright face clouded with concern. "Headmistress," he said, taking in the scene with one quick glance that told him more than explanation might have done. "We have another manifestation in the East Tower, and one in the library as well. And Madam Pince reports that a book clasp fastened itself shut around a student's wrist before releasing her, though not before leaving words on the table where she had been reading." The book clasp. One of the 7 ghost images from the chamber. The conflict was multiplying. "What words?" McGonagall asked at once. Flitwick drew a steadying breath and answered, "Order remembers the obedient." The corridor seemed to grow colder after that, because the message was not random, nor even newly composed, but obviously part of the same system of principles, each sentence crafted to sound plausible enough on its own, while together they formed the outline of a worldview built on hierarchy, correction, repetition, and submission, which was precisely the sort of moral architecture Voldemort had always preferred beneath the theater of his violence. Elric made the decision at once. "Professor, seal the library and remove all students from the East Tower," he said, perhaps more sharply than protocol allowed. Though the urgency of the situation left no time for formal delicacy. No one is to touch loose objects, especially school materials, badges, clasps, mirrors, or anything behaving with unusual precision, and if you find further writing, do not erase it until we have documented the wording. Flitwick gave him a brief, searching look, then nodded, because Hogwarts staff had long ago learned that emergencies favored clarity over rank, and without another word, he hurried away. McGonagall turned back to Elric. "We must return below," she said, "because if the principals are manifesting upstairs, then the chamber is coordinating them, and unless Miriam has already found a weakness in the arrangement, the pace will continue to increase." Elric looked at the chalk one final time, and made a swift choice, placing over the desk not a destructive curse, but a mirrored stasis charm designed to force the anchor to repeat only itself and nothing beyond itself, trapping the object in a loop so narrow that it could not meaningfully interact with its surroundings. And though the chalk continued to move, its writing now layered exactly atop its previous line instead of extending across the wood. A small victory, perhaps, but a real one. "That will buy minutes, not hours," he said. "At present," McGonagall replied, already striding towards the stair, "minutes will have to suffice." They moved quickly through the corridors, and everywhere Elric now noticed details he might once have overlooked. A prefect's badge lying abandoned on a windowsill as though forgotten in haste, a quill rolling slowly across the stones against the slope of the floor, a silver hand mirror left face down on a bench though no student was near it, and each of these things seemed to carry not active danger yet, but potential, the kind of dormant alignment that a hidden system might seize upon at any moment. The castle, he realized, was full of candidate anchors. And that was what made the plan so brilliant and so vile, because Voldemort had not hidden 7 exact objects to be found one by one, but had designed a structure capable of conscripting the nearest suitable detail whenever conditions allowed, meaning that the school itself provided endless material for its own quiet subversion. When they reached the concealed stair and descended once more into the buried chamber, the change there was immediate and alarming. The floor pattern, which before had glowed in thin, restrained lines, now burned with a steadier light, and above the central pedestal there hung a faint lattice of pale threads, no wider than spider silk, converging and parting in a slow rotation that resembled thought becoming structure, while Miriam Strout stood within a ring of protective wards near the western wall, her sleeves scorched at one cuff and her expression stripped of all reserve. "You took too long," she said, not accusingly, but as one states a fact that has already extracted its price. And she pointed at the empty recesses, where 3 of the 7 ghost images had become stronger, denser, nearer to substance than before. The quill, the book clasp, the chalk. All 3 now lingered half visible in their assigned places, not yet fully present and yet no longer merely absent. "They are being written into position from above," Miriam said, and the severity in her voice made the chamber itself seem to listen. "The system has stopped waiting for retrieval and begun imprinting equivalents through active use in the castle, which means the conflict has entered its final movement, because once all 12 principles stabilize, the pedestal will have enough conceptual force to perform its real function." Elric's gaze snapped to the empty stone top at the center. "And what is that function?" Miriam answered at once. "To create a permissive locus," she said, "a place within Hogwarts where Voldemort's logic is no longer resisted by the castle, but recognized by it, a point from which later influence, possession, recruitment, or darker work could enter far more easily because the school would already have been taught not to reject the pattern." For one brief moment, no one spoke. Then McGonagall drew herself to her full height, and the authority in her presence was such that even the pulsing lines on the floor seemed to recede before it. "Then we end it here," she said. "Not delay it, not contain it. End it." Elric felt in those words the shape of the path ahead, difficult and dangerous and perhaps narrow as a blade, yet unmistakably the path required, and as the pale lattice above the pedestal brightened, and one more faint whisper drifted through the chamber's dome like breath over glass, he knew that the next step would decide whether Hogwarts remained itself or began, in the smallest, unnoticed ways, to become hospitable to something that had no right ever again to dwell within its walls. For a single suspended moment after Minerva McGonagall spoke those decisive words, the chamber seemed to contract inward, as though the very air had taken notice of the intention set against it. And Elric Vane understood with a clarity sharper than any spell that the conflict had reached its final and most dangerous phase, because what stood before them was no longer a hidden design unfolding in secrecy, but an active structure resisting interference. And such structures, when threatened, often revealed their most aggressive tendencies. The pale lattice above the central pedestal intensified, its threads tightening and brightening until they formed a slow-turning sphere of interwoven lines, each one pulsing with the same quiet insistence that had guided the anchors from the beginning. Yet now the rhythm had changed, no longer patient and exploratory, but focused and accelerating, as though the system had recognized the presence of opposition and begun to hasten its own completion. Miriam Strout moved at once, stepping into the outer edge of the floor pattern and driving her wand downward with controlled force, releasing a disruption charm so precise that it did not shatter the visible structure, but instead sought to sever the alignment between the active anchors and the incomplete ones forming above. And for a heartbeat, the chamber reacted, the light faltering, the lattice thinning, and the threads wavering as though their cohesion had been briefly undone. Then the system adapted. The 5 occupied recesses flared in unison, their contents glowing not with raw magical intensity, but with a kind of conceptual reinforcement, as though each object were asserting its role within the pattern, strengthening the principles they embodied, and in answer the half-formed anchors in the empty recesses grew more defined, their outlines sharpening as though the system had chosen to compensate rather than collapse. "It is resisting isolation," Miriam said, her voice tight with concentration, "because the structure is not dependent on any single connection, but on the cumulative weight of all active principles, which means we cannot dismantle it piece by piece. We must break its coherence as a whole." Elric stepped forward, his gaze fixed upon the central pedestal, because the realization had already begun to take shape in his mind, that the true vulnerability of the system might not lie in the anchors themselves, but in the point where their combined influence converged, and if that convergence could be disrupted, then the pattern might fail to sustain itself, regardless of how many individual components remained active. "The pedestal," he said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "It is the locus, the point where all principles are unified, and if we can break that unity, the sequence may collapse." Minerva McGonagall turned toward it at once, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the shifting lattice above. And though the risk was evident, the necessity was greater, for the chamber was no longer a place of discovery, but a battleground of influence, where hesitation would serve only the system they sought to destroy. "Then we act together," she said, her voice firm, "because no single spell will suffice, and whatever we attempt must disrupt not only the magic, but the pattern of intent that sustains it." The three of them moved into position around the pedestal, forming a triangle that enclosed the central point, and as they raised their wands, the air within the chamber thickened, the light from the lattice casting shifting shadows across their faces, as though the system itself were watching, measuring, preparing to respond. Elric focused his mind not on destruction, but on contradiction, because if the sequence relied upon repetition and reinforcement, then its undoing must lie in interruption and variance, in breaking the rhythm that allowed the principles to take hold. And with that thought, he began to weave a counter-pattern, a spell not of force, but of disruption, designed to unravel the alignment between idea and manifestation. Miriam followed, her magic precise and analytical, targeting the connections between the anchors and the central locus, seeking to destabilize the pathways through which their influence flowed, while McGonagall, drawing upon both power and experience, cast a binding charm that sought to fix the chamber in its current state, preventing further adaptation long enough for the disruption to take effect. For a moment, the three forces converged. The lattice shuddered. The light fractured, and the pedestal beneath them emitted a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone and into their bones. Then the system reacted. The half-formed anchors surged forward, their outlines solidifying further as though pulled into existence by the pressure of the counterspells, and from the lattice above, there descended a series of thin, darting threads that lashed toward the floor, not striking with force, but seeking contact. Seeking to re-establish the broken connections by any available path. One such thread brushed against Elric's sleeve, and in that instant a thought entered his mind. Not loud, not commanding, but insistent, a suggestion rather than a command. "Finish it." The phrase was subtle, almost reasonable, and for a fraction of a second it seemed not foreign, but his own. An idea that the sequence might be better understood if allowed to complete, that control might be maintained if the pattern were observed in its final form. And it was precisely this quiet persuasion that revealed its true danger, for it did not demand obedience, but invited it. Elric forced the thought away, tightening his grip on the spell he was weaving, and spoke aloud, not as a warning to the others, but as an anchor to his own intent. "It is influencing thought," he said, his voice cutting through the hum. "Do not trust any conclusion that leads toward completion." Miriam nodded sharply, her own focus unwavering, while McGonagall's expression hardened further, her magic intensifying as she reinforced the binding charm. And for a moment the balance shifted, the lattice dimming once more as the counter-pattern took hold. The pedestal cracked. A thin line appeared across its surface, running from edge to edge, and from within that line there seeped a faint, dark light, not bright, not forceful, but dense, as though the structure itself were under strain, its coherence beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of their spells. "It is working," Miriam said, though her voice carried no triumph, only urgency. "But it will not collapse cleanly, and when it breaks, the backlash may spread through the network." Elric understood at once what that meant, because the system extended throughout Hogwarts, and any uncontrolled release of its energy could trigger manifestations elsewhere, perhaps even complete the very sequence they were trying to prevent. And so the conflict reached its final and most delicate point, where success required not only breaking the structure, but doing so in a way that prevented its fragments from reforming. "We must redirect it," he said, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Not destroy it outright, but collapse it inward, forcing the pattern to resolve into itself rather than outward into the castle." McGonagall met his gaze, and in that instant there was no need for further explanation, for she understood the logic and the risk alike, and with a single decisive motion, she altered her spell, shifting its focus from containment to compression, driving the unstable energy back toward the pedestal even as it threatened to burst outward. Miriam followed at once, her disruption pattern tightening, guiding the collapsing structure into a narrower and narrower space, while Elric completed the final weave of his counter-pattern, aligning it with the collapsing lattice so that the principles themselves would fold back upon their origin rather than disperse into the environment. The chamber trembled. The light flared. And for a brief, blinding instant, the entire structure collapsed into the pedestal. Then there was silence. The lattice vanished. The anchors dimmed, and the faint hum that had filled the air ceased entirely. For a moment, none of them moved, because the absence of reaction was as startling as any explosion might have been, and Elric felt a cautious relief begin to rise within him, tempered by the knowledge that such systems rarely ended without consequence. Then the pedestal shattered. Not outward, but inward, its surface folding into itself as though consumed by its own design, leaving behind a shallow depression in the stone where the central locus had once stood, and within that depression there remained nothing but a faint trace of residual magic, already fading into stillness. The sequence was broken. The conflict, at last, had been resolved. Yet, as Elric lowered his wand, he knew that the cost of that resolution would not be measured only in the silence that followed, but in the understanding that Voldemort's final design had come closer to completion than anyone had ever suspected, and that only through precision equal to his own had it been undone. For several long breaths after the pedestal collapsed inward upon itself, leaving behind nothing but a shallow, darkened hollow in the stone where the heart of the system had once resided, no one spoke, because the silence that followed was not empty, but full, laden with the weight of a conflict that had reached its resolution not through spectacle, but through precision. And Elric Vane, standing within the dim chamber beneath Hogwarts, understood that what they had ended here was not merely a sequence of enchantments, but the quiet continuation of a mind that had refused to accept defeat even in death. The light that had once traced the intricate pattern across the floor had faded to a dull, inert sheen, and the 5 occupied recesses now held their objects without motion or presence. The cracked goblet, the tarnished brooch, the broken wand, the strip of blackened vellum, and the final unidentified piece all resting as nothing more than what they appeared to be. Ordinary remnants stripped of the intent that had animated them. Yet even in their stillness there lingered a faint echo, a memory of alignment that would not be easily forgotten. Miriam Strout was the first to lower her wand completely, her shoulders easing by a degree so slight that only those accustomed to reading such details would have noticed. And when she spoke, her voice carried not relief, but measured certainty. "The structure has collapsed cleanly," she said, her gaze fixed upon the hollow where the pedestal had been, "which means the principles have been forced back into non-coherence, unable to sustain themselves without a central locus, and without that, the network will not reform." Minerva McGonagall inclined her head, though her expression remained grave, because she understood, as Elric did, that the end of this particular threat did not erase the significance of what had been uncovered, nor the method by which it had been constructed. "He attempted to teach the castle to remember him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not as a presence, but as a pattern, which would have been far more insidious, because it would have allowed his influence to persist without the need for a body or even a direct agent. Whoa! Elric stepped closer to the center of the chamber, his eyes tracing the faint lines that remained etched into the floor, now inert but still visible, like the outline of a thought that had been erased but not entirely forgotten. And as he looked upon them, he felt not fear, but a deep and sober understanding of the conflict they had resolved. It was never about bringing him back, he said slowly, as though shaping the truth with each word, but about ensuring that the conditions which allowed him to rise in the first place could be quietly restored, piece by piece, through ordinary actions, until resistance itself became less natural than acceptance. Miriam nodded, her expression thoughtful, despite the exhaustion that now edged her movements. And that is why the anchors were so small, she added, because the smallest details pass unnoticed, and what passes unnoticed shapes behavior more effectively than anything that demands attention. For a time they remained there, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because the chamber, though now silent, represented a lesson that extended beyond the immediate danger, a reminder that power need not always manifest as force, but could instead take root in repetition, in habit, in the quiet shaping of thought until the outcome seemed inevitable rather than imposed. At last, McGonagall turned toward the stair, her decision made with the same clarity that had guided her throughout the ordeal. "We must ensure that the effects above have ceased," she said, "and that no residual influence remains within the castle, because even a weakened pattern may persist if left unattended." They ascended together, the path now unchanged, the corridors no longer shifting or guiding, the castle returning to its familiar state as though the subtle tension that had permeated it was slowly dissolving. And when they reached the upper halls, the difference was immediately apparent. The air felt lighter. The faint whispering that had once threaded through the corridors was gone. And the objects that had begun to act of their own accord now lay still. Their unnatural behavior ended as abruptly as it had begun. They returned to the charms corridor, where the desk remained as they had left it, the chalk resting motionless at its center, the repeated lines no longer extending across the surface, but fixed in place as inert markings, devoid of the intent that had once driven them. McGonagall examined the desk closely, her wand tracing the edges of the inscription, and after a moment she straightened, her expression easing for the first time since the conflict had begun. "It is over," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of certainty that had been earned through action rather than assumption. Elric allowed himself a slow breath, the tension that had held him steady through each stage of the investigation now beginning to recede. And as he looked around the corridor, at the familiar stone, the quiet light, and the absence of unseen influence, he felt the full resolution of the conflict settle into place. The system had been dismantled. The sequence had been broken. And the pattern had been denied the chance to take root. Yet even as that resolution brought a measure of calm, it did not erase the understanding that had come with it, because what they had faced was not a singular anomaly, but an example of a method, a way of thinking that had once belonged to Lord Voldemort, and which might, in other forms, arise again wherever vigilance faltered. Miriam turned to Elric, her expression thoughtful, and spoke with quiet seriousness. "You noticed it," she said, "before it became complete, which means you understood the danger in the details, and that is what allowed us to stop it." Elric considered her words, not as praise, but as a simple statement of fact, and nodded once. "It was never hidden," he replied, "only overlooked." McGonagall regarded him for a moment, her gaze steady, and then inclined her head in acknowledgement, not of him alone, but of the principle that had guided their actions. "Then let that be the lesson we remember," she said, her voice calm yet firm, "because the greatest threats are not always those that declare themselves openly, but those that wait within the smallest things, shaping the world one unnoticed detail at a time." The corridor fell quiet once more, not with tension, but with the natural stillness of a place restored to itself. And as Elric Vane prepared to depart from Hogwarts, he carried with him not only the knowledge that the conflict had been resolved, but the certainty that vigilance must extend beyond the obvious, into the subtle, the ordinary, and the easily ignored. For in the end, it had not been power that nearly allowed Voldemort to return. It had been detail. And it was in the details that he had been defeated.
Ну що ж, друзяшки, зараз перед вами професор Саламандр без свого аватару. Хотів трошки поговорити історію, об'яснити цінність, яку я хотів для вас принести. Дивіться, вас тут може зачепити не прихований зал під Хогвартсом і не магічні артефакти, а звичайна крейда, яка вперто писала одну і ту саму фразу. Наскільки проста річ, що більшість людей навіть не звернув би на неї увагу. Мені здається, що саме в цьому захований справжній урок цієї історії. Великі зміни в нашому житті рідко починаються з чогось грандіозного. Частіше вони починаються з маленьких повторів, з думки, про яку ми дозволяємо собі щодня. Зі звички, які не помічаємо, зі слова, яке постійно звучить у нашій голові. Саме так формується характер людини не одним великим рішенням, а сотнями дрібниць, які поступово стають нормою. Ельрік зрозумів, що небезпека ховалася не в могутній магії, а в непомітних деталях. І в реальному житті це працює так само. Варто уважніше подивитися до того, що ми повторюємо щодня, бо з часом саме це починає керувати нашим вибором. Іноді найважливіше в історії не те, що кричить про себе, а те, що тихо повторюється на задньому плані, бо саме маленькі речі, зрештою, визначають, ким ми стаємо. До зустрічі!